you need a high volume of training. So, that 80% of the high volume training to get that large increase in mitochondrial volume. But getting that high intensity interval training, around about 100% of VO2 max and even above, then that seems to be more important for increasing mitochondrial function. And we've tended to see greater improvements in mitochondrial function with that level 3 type training.
That Triathlon Show 215. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Professor David Bishop. Professor Bishop is a world leader in muscle exercise physiology and has published more than 250 publications. He leads the Skeletal Muscle and Training Research Group at the Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia, which has a focus of examining how exercise, genes, and diet interact to regulate skeletal muscle adaptations and to translate this new knowledge at a cellular and mitochondrial level into recommendations for improving human performance. And one of the main topics that we really get into today is discussing volume and intensity, the adaptations of each, and how you can balance the two adequately to get the best of both worlds, and which one might be more important than the other. So we'll get into that right after thanking our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration that you can find on precisionhydration.com. And we're looking forward to having founder Andy Blow back for another hydration episode at some point quite soon. So I would encourage you to send in any questions that you want to get asked or topics that you want us to specifically touch on regarding hydration, electrolytes, and cramping to my email, michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K, and we can tackle them when we have Andy back on the podcast. As you know, if you listen to, for example, episode 49 with him or any of the newer episodes, he's super knowledgeable in this area, so I'm always super keen to discuss with him and hear all that he has to say about this topic. You can check out Precision Hydration's electrolyte products and get a free online sweat test on precisionhydration.com. And you can get 15% off your entire order with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. Also, if you're a new customer and you've never used Precision Hydration before, you can get your first box or tube for free with the code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps. Big thanks also to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka are the leading manufacturers of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear, and even casual day-to-day eyewear and prescription glasses. So check out all they have to offer in any of those categories on their website and get 20% off your entire order with the promo code TTS20. As we are now in 2020, perhaps you might want to check if all your equipment is in order, or if it's something that needs replacing, it's broken, that happens, wetsuits for example. If you're in that position, definitely consider Roka, because they spend so much resources on making sure that their products are the best in their categories. The amount of research and development that they do is really admiring. So I highly encourage that you check that out. With the wetsuits, for example, the arms up technology is a famous example of how Roka are super innovative to make their products the best that they can be. Check them out on roka.com, and the promo code is TTS20. Without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Professor David Bishop. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, David. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks for inviting me on.
It's a pleasure to have you. Why don't you start by telling the listeners a little bit more about yourself and your background and your research interests?
Yeah, so I think my, like a lot of people, a bit of a varied background. So I initially started out as a physical education teacher, and so, teaching physical education in primary school and high school. And then I decided to go back and do a little bit more study. So I ended up doing a master's and then a PhD. And after that, I guess my first job was working at the Western Australian Institute of Sport. So that was working directly with elite athletes. Some of the athletes were, kayak athletes who went to the Sydney 2000 Olympics, as well as hockey players and also water polo team and a few other team sports as well. So that was a great sort of introduction to working with elite athletes. And then from there, I moved over to a university position. And so since then, so that's, nearly 20 years ago. So since then, been doing research broadly on trying to understand and also optimize adaptations to training and mostly more around the lines of, team sports, so intermittent performance, but also endurance performance.
Yeah, and that's definitely from the endurance performance perspective that I know of you and your research. So I didn't really know that you have done that much in team sport. But if we're sticking to the endurance theme, what are the general things that happen, the adaptations that happen when we train on a physiological level that we're looking for, generally speaking?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point, and it's one of the big challenges in, I guess, doing what you're doing, being an athlete or a coach, but also in doing research, is that there's a lot going on. So you got your muscles and blood and your heart and brain, all those sorts of things are adapting. And I guess as a researcher, you need to try and focus in a little bit. So most of my research has been on specifically skeletal muscle adaptation. So looking at how the muscle adapts to training and to different types of training prescriptions. And I guess in the last 10 years, actually originally before that, a lot of it was on pH regulation and, preventing lactate buildup in the muscles. But more recently in the last 10 years, that focus has switched to mitochondria, so that, the energy powerhouses of the muscle.
And what happened with the mitochondria? If somebody new listening to this that might not know what the mitochondria do and what they are important for, can you explain them in a little bit more detail and why they are important?
Yeah, so I think whenever there's something in the general press, you'll see the mitochondria referred to as the energy powerhouses of the muscle. And so the mitochondria is what's generating most of the ATP or energy that we're using. So, while we're sitting here talking, obviously there's a baseline energy expenditure. And so the mitochondria are working hard to supply all of the energy to support just your basal metabolic energy requirements. And then as you do endurance exercise, and your energy demands increase, the mitochondria are working hard to supply that extra energy that you need to perform the endurance tasks.
And when we're training, we're looking to improve the effectiveness or increase the amount of mitochondria. What are the adaptations that we're looking for on that side?
Yeah, you're asking some great questions, and that's another. So there's a lot of different mitochondrial adaptations that can occur. So I guess in simplistic terms, we can look at the content. So just that refers to I guess we can say the amount of mitochondria that you have in the muscles, and we'll probably talk about that later. So that seems to be important for not only health but endurance performance. So in particular, having more mitochondria seems to be related to a greater ability to utilize fat when you're exercising. But we can also improve the function of the mitochondria, so the amount of energy that the mitochondria can produce. And we've seen that those two are not necessarily one in the same. So you can get improvements in mitochondrial function without improvements in mitochondrial content. And I guess there's also, if we want to talk about efficiency, there's also how quickly the mitochondria adapt to a metabolic perturbation. So, most people will feel that, when you start exercising, you have what's called that oxygen debt, in that your muscles aren't like a car, in that when you turn on the engine, you're getting all the fuel that you need to supply the the energy to drive the motor. With a human being, it takes a little bit of takes a few minutes for the aerobic metabolism to ramp up, and so that's also related to the mitochondria. And with training, one of the adaptations that we'd like to see is that the mitochondria react more rapidly and increase their production of energy when you start to exercise.
In terms of you mentioned there that the mitochondrial function and content, they're not one and the same. Are there specific types of training that lead more to an adaptation in one than the other? Or is that still an unknown, why they are not one and the same?
Yeah, I think this podcast is going to be full of lots of unknowns, but we've definitely seen that different adaptations. So you'll see sometimes it can be confusing for some people. So there's some debate amongst different scientists working in this area. But with our research, we've tended to see that the very high intensity exercise, so close to VO2 max and above, seems to be better at increasing the mitochondrial function. And we've seen that increasing the amount of mitochondria, that seems to be more strongly related to the volume of training.
And I guess this leads us to the main questions for today. That's actually a big set of questions. We both have the list in front of us, but the topic of volume and intensity, you recently published a discussion paper about how the two relate and the adaptations to mitochondrial content in terms of what you get out of volume and intensity. So can you discuss what you did in that paper and analyzing the current state of research a bit more?
Yeah, sure. So I think you're talking about, we just had what's called a Crosstalk debate, which is a nice initiative of the Journal of Physiology. And so what it does, it gets a couple of some prominent researchers who have different views on a topic and gets them to debate the different sides of a particular topic. And so we were arguing that the content is more important. And from our research, and also when we look at the body of research as a whole, the greatest increases in mitochondrial content are typically seen with the highest volumes of training. So, and I think, in some ways, the nice thing about that as well is that, it aligns with what elite athletes do. So there's not too many elite athletes, I would think, that aren't doing high volumes of training at certain times during the week. And, we were talking before we got on, you'd just done 2.5 hours of cycling. And so I think that matches up with probably part of the reason why at different times during the microcycle and macrocycle, that high volumes of training are important.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the crosstalk that I was referring to exactly. And so why do you think, if content might be the more important in terms of content versus function of the mitochondria, do you have any idea why that is?
We don't. And again, a great question. And I think with all of the interesting thing with the mitochondria is, they're producing energy. So I guess the assumption is that having more and better mitochondria is likely to improve endurance performance. But it's difficult to find really strong evidence for that. And I think it's probably because most of the best athletes don't give muscle biopsies, so we don't actually know a lot about their mitochondrial content or function. But I think it makes sense. And I think if you think about where the mitochondria are, having more mitochondria and having them closer to where the energy needs to go, so in terms of muscle contraction, closer to the actin and myosin filaments, then probably having more mitochondria can be a benefit to get the energy closer to where it needs to go.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I had not thought about that. Do you think that the relationship between training volume and mitochondrial content adaptations or increases in mitochondrial content is sort of linear, or is it linear but only up until a certain point, or is there some other relationship there that is more difficult to explain?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we looked at, so not just our studies, but the studies out there, and also animal studies, and as well as human studies, we didn't really see any evidence of a plateau. So I think my gut feeling is that greater volumes of training will lead to greater improvements or greater increases in mitochondrial content. And they didn't actually measure mitochondrial content, but there's some really great studies by Hickson back in the 1980s, and they looked at changes in VO2 max over a 10 or 12 week training period, and they had quite high volumes of training, and they also didn't see any plateau in VO2 max after that time. So, I mean, obviously VO2 max will plateau at some stage, but I think that there has to be a point where it will plateau. But I think for most of the stuff I've seen, the volumes that have been tested, there does seem to be a linear relationship between training volume and increases in mitochondrial content.
Yeah. And what association, if any, have you found between intensity and changes in mitochondrial content specifically? We're still talking about content and not function.
Yeah, and that was part of the crosstalk. And so when we're talking about that, I mean, studies with high intensity training have definitely seen improvements in mitochondrial content. But what we don't see is any relationship between the intensity and the changes in mitochondrial content. So if you do higher intensity training, we don't see any evidence that will lead to greater increases in mitochondrial content than lower intensity training. So definitely, some of the, Marty Gabala in Canada has done some great work. So it is possible to get improvements in mitochondrial content with high intensity training, but our interpretation of the evidence is that you need to get the greatest improvements in mitochondrial content. You need quite high volumes of training.
So can you explain that again? Because I didn't quite get that when you're saying that you
sure.
can get mitochondrial content with intensity, but at the same time, higher intensity or more intensity. Did you refer to higher intensity or more intensity there doesn't give you more increases in mitochondrial content?
Yeah, exactly. So I think, to put it another way, so Marty has shown, and others have shown as well, that if you do some sprint interval training, so all out sprints, you can get increases in mitochondrial content as measured in the muscle. But you could also get similar. So the sprint interval training is all out, so it might be 150 to 200% of your VO2 max. If you do some sort of high intensity interval training, you can also get some increases in mitochondrial content, and similar to the much higher intensity sprint interval training. So I think we don't see a linear relationship. So if you went from 80%, 100% VO2 max up to 150% VO2 max, we don't see greater increases in mitochondrial content. You can see some small sort of 15 to 20% increase in mitochondrial content, but it tends to be less than, with some of the very high volumes of training, we can see upwards of 50% increase in mitochondrial content.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. What about in terms of the intensity level? Something I've talked and interviewed Professor Paul Larson quite a bit, a few times, and read his book and articles about high intensity interval training, and he seems to be prescribing mostly or trying to hammer down that if you are going to do high intensity interval training, trying to get to 90% of VO2 max or 95% of VO2 max, that's when you really might get the most bang for your buck of your intervals, and trying to design your intervals in a way that you'll reach that level might be optimal. Do you agree with that when it comes to intensity, or what's your view?
Yeah, I think, my view, and I think it's consistent with the literature, is there's not one magic intensity. And I think, probably what our research supports more than anything else is some of the great work by Stephen Sealer on the polarized training concept. And I think so. Our research, like I said, I think it fits in nicely with that concept in that there's a definite role in terms of mitochondria of very high volumes of low to moderate intensity training to get that volume stimulus. But there's definitely also a place for high intensity interval training. I'd say if I was going to do high intensity interval training, I'd agree with Paul. I think, pretty close to VO2 max is probably where you want to be with your high intensity interval training. We've also seen, though, different adaptations with sprint interval training. So I think, the high intensity interval training would be, I don't know, somewhere between intervals of probably, 1 to 6 minutes. But if you're doing the sprint interval training, which is close to all out for, around about 20 to 30 seconds, and then longer recoveries, up to around about 4 minutes or so, I think there's also a place for that. So I think, and this is also consistent with the way athletes train. I wouldn't think there'd be too many athletes that would only be doing high volume training or only be doing high intensity interval training or only be doing sprint interval training. And I think, just like, I like to think of it in terms of the diet pyramid, where you've got, different types of nutrition that's important. I think it's the same with training, and those different types of training all have their role. And probably the big challenge is trying to get the balance right and how to put those components together.
Yeah. And you mentioned Stephen Seiler there. He's another past guest on the podcast, so the listeners will be very familiar with his work on the 80-20 split in terms of sessions in his original research anyway, that 80% of sessions are performed at a relatively low intensity, below or at LT1, and 20% higher than that. And in terms of time, he claims that up to 90% of the time is spent in the low intensity zone in elite athletes. Do you think, is there any research that backs up those claims on the physiological and cellular and mitochondrial level?
I think, we definitely want to do some of that research. Most of the research has been at a performance level. So there was a paper a couple of years ago kind of backing up some of Stephen's ideas, where they had one group do kind of a mixed sort of training with it reasonably evenly distributed across level 1, level 2, and level 3. And there was another group that did the polarized training, and that group got greater improvements in performance. From a cellular level, I think, I've actually got a PhD student who's about to embark on some of that project, but there hasn't been, I'm not aware of any research looking at the cellular adaptations. As I said, I think the closest you can get is if we look across the literature, and at least from the mitochondria, I think our research would suggest that there's a different role for those different types of training and different mitochondrial adaptation. So I think our work does kind of align with the idea that you need a high volume of training. So, that 80% of the high volume training to get that large increase in mitochondrial volume. But getting that high intensity interval training, around about 100% of VO2 max and even above, then that seems to be more important for increasing mitochondrial function. And we've tended to see greater improvements in mitochondrial function with that level 3 type training.
Yep. And what about, that leads us to the moderate intensity training, so your classic tempo or threshold type workouts. Is there anything we can say about that type of training and how the adaptations that you might get from that?
Yeah, and I think one of the, just a quick side point, I think the challenge is that the tempo training can be quite different for different people, and certainly if people are basing it on the the lactate threshold. We just published a paper towards the end of last year showing that depending on how the lactate threshold is calculated, you can get a very different power output. So I think you need to be, if people are out there reading the papers, you need to be very careful that you're comparing apples with apples in terms of the tempo or threshold training. I think, Stephen's work kind of says that most athletes avoid doing too much of that sort of tempo threshold training. I think, we haven't done a lot of research on the cellular adaptations there, but I think the research out there does support trying to avoid exercising doing too much at that particular intensity. I think the only the only caveat I would ask is we're only talking about the physiological adaptations here, and so I think that tempo work can be quite hard. So that maybe for a podcast with someone, a sports psychologist, but talking to coaches and athletes, I think there's a role for that very tough psychologically type of training to improve some of those psychological aspects.
Yeah. So this is actually an interesting topic, because I talked with some people, like, for example, one interview that comes to mind is with Matt Fox from Australia, like you, who runs the Sweat Elite website, and he spent a lot of time in Kenya, among others, training with the Eliud Kipchoge's running group. And when he discussed their typical training week, it just seemed like they were doing a lot of tempo type training, very much not a polarized model, so more pyramidal. So they still obviously did a lot of low intensity and high volume, but most of their quality running, and there was quite a lot of it, came at that tempo to threshold type of intensity. And even looking at what a lot of the World Tour cycling teams are doing, also anecdotally, again, from an outside perspective, it looks like they're doing a lot of that. So that's just why I've recently been very interested in this, and going back and look at the polarized training research and see what sort of groups that they've done that research in, because I think that the tempo training seems to still be very prominent in many like elite sports settings, but I guess it might very much relate to what the specific event that you're training for is and what the demands of that event is, because the demands of the marathon is very different from cross-country skiing, which is much more variable with the terrain and surges and things like that. And also the fact that these days in cross-country skiing, you might be a specialist at the sprint distance, which lasts 2 to 3 minutes, but you also want to do well in the 50K if you want to do well in the overall World Cup and bring home a lot of Olympic medals. So it's a fascinating topic always to discuss this.
Anyway. Sorry, mate. I was going to say that I think the fascinating thing is that there's definitely, I think it's great to look at elite athletes, and I think you can find examples of people who are doing lots of, almost contrasting types of training. So I think you'll find examples of very successful athletes who quite closely follow, the polarized 80-20 model. You'll find examples of elite athletes who do a lot of high intensity interval training, and much more than the 20%. And then you'll also find examples of people who do a lot of tempo training. And I think one of the things we're working on is I think one of the difficulties is making sure that we're talking about the same thing. And I think you kind of mentioned it in there, it appears that the type of training that they're doing. And I think, there's lots of what people are calling the different thresholds and training levels or domains, whichever term you want to use, can be different from different between different researchers or different training groups. And so I would say that what we've seen is that there's exercising below the lactate threshold which would probably include some of that tempo training, I think you can still do you can still get quite high volume training by doing that type of training.
Yeah, exactly. And for elite Ironman athletes, for example, even their first lactate threshold, which in Seiler's research would be considered low intensity training, that's actually pretty hard for them considering the level that they're at, or, not hard, but something that if you are to go out and do 2 times 1 hour race pace intervals, race pace might be right at LT1, and it might feel like almost like a tempo workout, but it could be classified as low intensity training in Seiler's research.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you look at the different some of the thresholds for the German rowing models and the Australian cycling and rowing models as well, then they have typically there'll be 2 training zones. So level 1 in that instance, which is below the first lactate threshold, is really recovery and cool down, warm up type training. And then we have level 2 and level 3, which are both below the lactate threshold. So I think there's more work to be done there to have to be nice for people to be on the same page and with the same terminology. So I would, I think some of that training, I think, can still fit into the polarized type of model. I think what I would be, in some ways kind of blending the 2 models is I would be avoiding doing too much training close to the lactate threshold, but, really close to the lactate threshold. But I think if you're, 5 or 10% below the lactate threshold, some people would call that tempo training, but I think I would still put that into the high volume type training.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. And one follow-up, by the way, on what you mentioned earlier about the differences in lactate threshold testing. Do you remember off the top of your head what sort of differences you saw depending on the protocol used to assess the lactate threshold?
Yeah, we were using fairly well-trained runners, and I think from memory, there was something like 150 watts difference from from the highest calculated value to the lowest calculated value. So and we made some recommendations in that particular paper. The first author is Nick Jamnik. We made some recommendations in that paper, but I think it's an important consideration. And I can't remember, we calculated the lactate threshold using something like 30 different methods. And so there's sometimes people talk about the lactate threshold as though it's one magical threshold, but it can actually vary quite a lot depending on how the athlete or the particular lab has calculated it.
Yeah, I've seen this recently in an athlete that I coach that got some results that were absolutely really making no sense at all. But it turns out that it was because of the protocol used in the software that his triathlon club were using for the testing. So actually, the old eyeballing method seemed to work much better for us in that instance.
And I think it's a real good. I mean, I'm a scientist, but for whatever reason, sometimes I think you do need to have experience in doing lactate threshold, because sometimes, you can see that sometimes you can get, just for whatever reason, some strange data, whether the analyzer has done something funny or there's some sweat gets into the blood sample. So there is like in a lot of these things with athletes, there's a little bit of art to the science as well. Yeah,
definitely. So on this topic of volume and intensity and training adaptations to the 2, not necessarily one against the other, but what would you suggest are the practical takeaways from what we've discussed so far?
Yeah, well, I think the couple of things I would say is, so I think there's lots of different ways to get to the same point. So I think, there's no magical training intensity. I think it's important to get a little bit of across the different training intensities and volumes. I still believe that the volume is critical. Is critical. So I think I think Stephen's model is pretty close in terms of approximately getting that polarized 80-20. I agree with you is that I think sometimes the level one, at least how it's calculated in some of Stephen's papers, is possibly a little bit too low. And so I think that including in that high volume component, that 80%, I think some of the training that some others might describe more like tempo training can also be included. And I mean, some of that above at level one, people can maintain that for 90 minutes, 120 minutes. So I think those sorts of durations can be quite comfortably placed into that 80%. From what I've seen, I think, and I know I said different people do it, but I wouldn't be doing too many training sessions at around about the lactate threshold. And I think that's where, trying to spread the training across those different volumes and intensities is important. And I think the other thing that I've noticed with any good athletes that I've worked with is I think they're really good at monitoring and recording and then reviewing the type of training. So I think one of the big benefits of whatever approach that an athlete takes is then reviewing it at the end of the year and being able to see, okay, this year I distributed my training this way and I got my best results, or I plateaued and I didn't improve, and then being able to go back and modify the training based on the season's results and the type of training that they'd been doing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Very great. One follow-up on what you just talked about with the Stevens research. When you talk about 80-20, do you talk about number of sessions or total duration?
I tend to try and do it more in terms of training in what I would say training volume. So in that way, I think the duration can be misleading. So if we're doing it in the laboratory, what we typically do is try and get, if you think of it something like an analogy as in strength training, where you might you'll take the number of repetitions and multiply it by the weight. So if you're doing 6 repetitions with 100 kilos, then that might be equivalent to 10 repetitions with 60 kilos. So you're getting a volume of weight lifted. And so we tend to apply the same sort of approach to endurance training. So what we typically do is take the intensity and multiply that by the exercise duration in the actual training session. So that way, for argument's sake, a 20-minute high intensity interval training session isn't the same as a 20-minute high volume L1 low intensity training session.
Yeah, so you would score that as like a 20-minute level 3, or let's say call it like in a free zone model, zone 3 type interval. So a total of 20 minutes of high intensity intervals would score, for example, 60 points, and then versus 60 minutes of low intensity would score the same amount of points. Is that sort of what you're getting at there? Or
yeah, exactly. And when we do it in the laboratory, it's a little bit easier. So what we'll typically do is we'll multiply the percent VO2 max times the duration. So if someone did intervals and they might get 30 minutes at 100% of VO2 max, then you could get 300 points, units or whatever you want to call it, for that particular training session. Whereas if you did, 60% of VO2 max, then that would be 50 minutes would be the equivalent. So 50 minutes, and you'd also get 300 points from that. So I have seen some people do exactly what you said and give 1, 2, or 3 points, or sometimes people will give a higher point. So maybe 1, 3, 5 points, depending on the zones. So that I haven't seen any, scientific investigation into the validity of doing that way. And I think probably I think that's if you don't have something better, then that can be a nice approximate. But I guess one of the limitations of that approach is it means that everything in level 3 is being scored the same. Whereas if you're working, close to the bottom of level 3 or the top of level 3, then that's obviously the intensity is different, and it's going to be the stress of that particular workout will change also.
Yeah, and then the idea being then that you would accumulate roughly 80% of your training volume calculated as per you just described, but 80% of those points, whatever you want to call them, would come from low intensity training. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So then it's looking at the points. So sometimes I think it gets a bit confusing. So sometimes I've referred to that as like a training volume score, but I think that does confuse people. So if you wanted to say, use it as some sort of points method, then that's what we would typically do. So not based on duration, but the combination of duration and intensity to give a point score.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's similar to the training stress score model that a lot of people are using. Do you have
exactly?
But that's generally based on functional threshold power. What are your thoughts on that model? This is a completely different topic that we didn't prepare, but if you're happy to talk about it, then this is actually something that comes up quite a lot from the listeners. So I would be interested to hear your thoughts on the training stress score model and also the metrics that it generates, like the chronic training load and acute training load, and how people might be using them.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, I think it's really hard to get an accurate measure of the training stress, and I think because I think the different types of training do activate different signaling pathways in the muscles. So I think it's really challenging to compare them, but I think where it is useful is when people are reviewing their training, and I think some of the examples you mentioned there is that people can get an idea that if in a year or in a week I accumulate this much training stress, then I get good adaptations, or I find myself, going overreaching and getting fatigued or whatever. So I think it's hard to get, I don't think it's going to be possible with different individuals and different types of training to get a perfect measure of training stress. But as long as people are using the same method, week in and week out and year after year, what it does do is it allows them to accumulate this historical knowledge of what tends to work for them, and then it allows them to use that for a base to manipulate or modify their training as they go forward.
Yeah, I think you hit on a couple of really, really important points there that as a coach, I definitely 100% agree with that approach. It is a good tool for certain things, like, for example, benchmarking 1 year against another or one key race against another. But the trap that I think that a lot of people, amateur athletes in particular, fall into is believing that more training stress score equals better. But as you say, different signaling pathways are activated by different types of training, and the trap that a lot of people fall into is that they think that low intensity training is useless because it doesn't give them a lot of training stress score. So why waste an hour doing an easy ride when you'll only get 30 TSS from it if you can do a 70 TSS ride or even a 60 TSS by just making the session moderate? But then at the end of the day, you lose out on a lot of that lower intensity training that is highly beneficial and necessary if you want to maximize adaptation. So, yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you just said.
Yeah, and I think it's important that I think like you said, I mean, I think sometimes there can be that train hard kind of concept, and if you're not falling off lying on the ground on your back for half an hour after a training session, you haven't done a quality training session. But from our work in the lab, like I said, we're definitely different types of training stress will stimulate different adaptations. And we've seen that recently where we looked at some of the pathways that are activated. And we looked at some of the cellular pathways that are activated when you do an exercise session below the lactate threshold and when you do an exercise session above the lactate threshold. And there's not that much in common between the two. So I think there's quite specific adaptations to the various types of training. And it's important to not just be looking at, like you said, getting as high a training stress as possible, but getting the right amount of stress in the different training zones.
Can you describe that in a bit more detail, what the different cellular adaptations and signaling pathways are for the different levels of intensity?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that are happening there. So one of and this may be part of the reason as well. So I mean, one thing that's changing is obviously the fuel use. So if we're using the levels that are more common to Stephen Sealer's approach, so when you're in level 1, you're going to be predominantly using fatty acids as your fuel. And then around about the first lactate threshold, ventilatory threshold, around about then you're probably going to get a peak in your fat oxidation. And then as you start to increase lactate in the muscle, that's going to feed back and decrease the fatty acid contribution, and you're going to start increasing the glycolytic contribution and get further increases in lactate. So that's probably part of the signaling process as well. And so we know that fatty acids and lactate and some of the other changes in metabolism stimulate some of these different signaling pathways. So I think that's why exercising in these different training zones, you're going to get different changes in the metabolic signals within the muscle, and that's then going to act downstream to stimulate different training adaptations. And so it seems like, I think, and I think this is where it does start to match up a little bit, is that low intensity training where you're predominantly using fatty acids seems to drive increases in mitochondrial content and also drives increases in fat metabolism. So that sort of training, and those two seem to be related. So people who have a greater mitochondrial content seem to be better able to use fat as an energy source. As you increase the intensity, then you're starting to get different signaling pathways activated and different adaptations being stimulated in the muscle as well.
Yeah, that closes the loop pretty nicely. So a thing related to the higher volume training and increases in mitochondrial content that I know you researched is twice a day exercise. Can you discuss that a little bit? What effects we see there, and also practical considerations that we might need to make when it comes to training twice per day, which is very common for even a lot of amateur triathletes.
Yeah. So we've just published 2 studies. So one of those, the first one was just looking at the response to that one day of training with 2 exercise sessions. And we saw that when there was one high intense or one training session closely followed by another training session, we saw a much greater activation of some of these signaling pathways. And we're still trying to work out exactly why, but I think part of it is that one of the things that happens when you're exercising is you can kind of think of it as in you're decreasing the fuel sources within the muscle. So obviously things like muscle glycogen get decreased, and you're also using up some of the fatty acids in the muscle. And we know that this kind of, for want of a better term, a nutrient deprivation is a really powerful signal to activate some of these signaling pathways. So I think what you're doing when you're exercising twice a day is that you're exercising your muscles when they've been nutrient deprived, and I think that augments the training stimulus. One of the challenges is, though, and if you've done it, it's really hard. And I think there's also we haven't done this particular research, but yeah, there have been studies where if people want to specifically study overtraining, then they quite often do twice a day training. So I think it can be a powerful stimulus, but I think it has to be used very carefully, and so as to avoid overtraining. And we have seen that beyond just the single response, probably there are studies by John Hawley and others has done some excellent work in this area, showing greater improvements in fat metabolism when this twice a day training is applied a few times a week for a few weeks. So I think that there's some evidence that it does work, but I think you have to be careful. And I think you need to be especially careful with what you do the day after this type of training. So we're just doing another study at the moment, and we're seeing that that the participants are less able to do a high intensity interval training the day after that they've done this type of training. So I think, again, you need a good coach who can, if you want to try some twice a day training, to make sure that it's very carefully periodized into the training plan.
What specifically did you have for outcome measures when you have studied this? Did you measure some sort of marker of signaling, or was it performance or something else?
We've done both. So we've done so the first study, which I think it's online but hasn't been published, was just as looking at the signaling. And what we saw there was a really powerful increase in the signaling when we did the twice a day training. And so, I mean, it's very clear from the results, without, you don't sort of need any fancy statistics. Just looking at it, you can see that there's very large differences between the conditions. And I think, your point, coming back to your point's a really good one, is that our signaling doesn't always match up with what then happens to performance. And so when we then looked at performance after 3 weeks of doing this type of training, we didn't see any beneficial changes, any differences in performance. And I'm pretty sure John Hawley's stuff hasn't seen any any differences in performance either. We do see greater increases in fat metabolism and some of those sort of adaptations. And John has also seen greater increases in a marker of mitochondrial content with the twice a day training. I think the important caveat is that all of the training studies, including ours, have been quite short and have been limited to, I think, 3 or 4 weeks. So it may be that a longer time is required to be able to see any performance benefits with this type of training.
And has the control group done the same total volume of training as the experimental group here, or is that different between the groups?
Yeah, in these studies, we always try and control the volume of training, and I think that's also one of the things that John in particular has looked at, is that when some participants are doing twice a day training, the group that's doing the twice a day training isn't able to train at as high intensity as they would normally be able to do. So that may be why the athletes aren't able to train as hard. So that may be part of the compromise, is that you're getting greater signaling, but it might come back to the training volume, is that the athletes end up either doing less intervals or slightly lower intensity when they're doing that second high intensity interval training session.
This is a a really interesting topic, especially I think for triathletes, because we have to do swim and bike and run training. So if you're an ambitious triathlete, whether it's amateur, but especially if you're an elite triathlete, like you're going to do twice a day sessions almost every day. And but then these considerations are things that need to be taken into account, obviously, like, and finding a good trade-off between maybe trying to plan in only once per day sessions before you have your key intense sessions or something like that. If you're, for example, focusing on one particular discipline, let's say it's to swim, and you want to hit a couple of really good swim workouts per week, then maybe the day before that swim should be a once per day training. And these are just some thoughts that are racing through my head as I hear you explain this. Are there any other considerations that come to mind for you when it comes to planning this? For example, with regards to nutrition, both between twice per day sessions, but also after that second per day session, so that you can recover for the next day's training.
Yeah, with and I guess again John Hawley and Louise Burke had a nice paper, I think towards the end of last year, talking about, because we're kind of getting into training with low carbohydrate. Talking there, so they talked about how to periodizing it. So I think the having the low carbohydrate, because of the previous training session, you can end up having low muscle glycogen stores before the second high intensity interval training. So that may limit some of the performance there. What we've been seeing is that we're just completing a study at the moment, and that it seems to be that consistent with most of the classic sports nutrition recommendations is that if you delay the carbohydrate ingestion after these high intensity training sessions, then performance the next day is impaired. So I would say that, especially, and I think it's consistent with the current guidelines, is that if the athletes are doing this twice a day training on occasions, then it's probably important to get carbohydrate quite quickly within that. If it is doing that type of training, it's important to get the carbohydrate within that post training window, so that they can rapidly replenish their muscle glycogen stores, so that they're ready to do the training, to do another solid training session the next day.
Yeah. And I know that your wife is trying to get to you, so I'm just going to cover one more topic here before we go to the rapid fire questions. So keeping on that same theme, what about the impact of nutrition, whether it be in workout or training low and things like that? What impact do you know of, and how have you seen in own studies on signaling and performance adaptations, if you've done that research?
Yeah, and I think this is interesting. It's where there's sometimes a little bit of a mismatch. So I think the training low idea, so training with low muscle glycogen stores, is really powerful to increase the signaling. But what we don't seem to be seeing is that necessarily being translated to performance. And I think part of that is because sometimes if the participants, the athletes are training with low muscle glycogen, it's probably affecting the quality of their training session. So I think the recommendations keep evolving, but I think some of the current idea is to maybe use the low muscle glycogen type training for when there's the low intensity training, because it may feel a little bit harder, but the athletes will still be able to complete the training session even if they've got lower than normal muscle glycogen stores. So trying to, I think, focus on the quality of the training session and using the low muscle glycogen type training when it's not going to affect the training quality. If, as I said, if there's going to be a hard training session the next day, then replacing the muscle glycogen stores quite quickly. So taking carbohydrates, within that first hour or two post-exercise, that seems to be important to ensure that a quality training session can be done the next day.
Yeah. I interviewed John Hawley as well on this topic, among others, and his recommendation was to do the train low type of protocol. Generally, at most twice per week. He said that any more than that, and it might be too much, even if you keep it to the low intensity sessions. So that was his point of view on it. Would you agree with that? That there is a limit to how often you should do it, even if you stick to the low intensity sessions?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I like about these sort of podcasts is it always generates some good research ideas. And so at the moment, I'm not aware of any research that has, have looked at that, whether you can, what is the optimal number of train low sessions to get the best adaptations. I think my guiding principle would be to ensure that you're getting good training quality. And so so that probably two to three is probably going to be the most that you'll be able to do without it interfering with the quality of the high intensity training sessions that people want to do. But I think that's what I'd be looking for, is that, and it may change with different periodizations, but as long as you can maintain the training quality, the high intensity training quality, then I think you can probably do 2, 3, or even 4 low muscle glycogen training sessions.
Yeah, I got it. And is there any other research that you're working on or have been working on that you want to discuss or just mention, so that we can keep up to date on what's coming up in your neck of the woods there?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of our research, and I think some of it's still we're doing at the moment. Just trying to think of anything that's about to come out. But so I guess most of my lab work, the group of my research group, is trying to optimize these endurance adaptations to training. So we're looking at different training prescriptions, but we're also looking, as we just spoke, nutritional strategies, and we've also tried looking at cold water immersion post exercise, and also training in the heat to see if we can augment the training adaptations. And I think what I think we're increasingly seeing, and I think it makes sense, is that it's the training that's obviously the most important aspect. And I think we haven't really seen using cold water or heat or these other manipulations, I think are turning out to be less important. I think sometimes people like them because they're kind of a quick fix to have some nutrient or to add some cold water or some heat. But I think our focus is going to remain more on the training quality. And I think as I said, what we want to do is to look at some of the research gaps that you've identified. Is how do you put these different types of training together to get the best, not only molecular adaptations but performance adaptations? And so a lot of research might be comparing low intensity training to high intensity training, but that's not how athletes train. Obviously, there's the mixture of those different training zones that go into a week or even a day. So that's our next couple of projects, is to look at what's how do you put together a training week with both low and moderate and high intensity training to get the best adaptations.
That is very exciting to hear, and good to hear, because the actual training is the bullseye if we want to improve as athletes. So, and I think there are so many questions and gaps in the knowledge that, and we've talked about quite a few of them already over the course of this interview. So I'm really looking forward to see what's coming out of your lab when it comes to designing the training and getting the most adaptations. So where can we keep up with your work? What is your lab, and what are the social media handles and other outlets where we can follow what's going on there?
Yeah, so I think these days social media is probably the best place. I mean, I work at Victoria University, and we do have our skeletal muscle and training research group. But the updating the web pages is always slower than I think social media. So all of any of our new publications we'll put on Twitter, and so my handle there is Blue Spot Science. And so if there's any new publications, people can definitely find them there, as well as the research of a lot of the other people that we've mentioned. I quite often retweet their work if it's related to this particular area.
Perfect. And to wrap up this interview, I have a few rapid fire questions for you, just one sentence or less to answer these. And the first one is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to endurance sports?
Okay.
Or physiology.
I'm actually going to, if I may, give you a completely different one. One of the books I read recently, which is brilliant, I think, is a book called Factfulness.
Yeah, I've heard about that. It's on my to-read list, actually.
Yeah, really? I think, I mean, I really enjoyed it. And I think it's basically, in many respects, it's kind of, like the fake media type thing, but it's really, and where I think it's relevant is it's about interpreting data. And so, I mean, what you can quite often see is, especially, in politics or whatever, what you will see is that, two sides can interpret the exact same, apparently the same facts, but completely different. So it just goes through, I think, it points out a lot of things that you quite commonly see reported on, and just says, look, this is, how to get to what the real facts are, and not what people are telling you are the facts.
Yeah. The next one is, what's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
I think especially in this line of work is that you need, and I think in any line of work, and I've seen this when I read about what other people have done, is blocking out your time. So, and I try and have, a few hours each day where I don't look at any email, I don't respond to email, I don't answer texts or anything like that. So I think avoiding distractions is key, so you can get quality work. So, and not looking at turning off all my notifications, so that I can wake up and do 4 or 5 hours of work before I'll get distracted by any emails or texts or whatever it might be.
And finally, who's somebody in sports or academia that you look up to?
My bias is, I like good scientists who are also doing, research that has good application. So I think, a few people, somewhere like Professor Keith Barr, I think he does excellent stuff. And I think he's a really good scientist, but he also has a way of communicating what that research means to other people. I think someone like Trent Stellingworth in Canada as well, another really good scientist, but a good scientist who understands athletes and how to communicate scientific findings simply and clearly to the athletes and coaches.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David, for coming on this interview. It was really great talking to you and hearing all your knowledge about these topics. So really appreciate it.
No, it was a pleasure to chat to you as well.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. And as usual, you can find the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com. There we will have links to some related episodes, guests that we mentioned during the interview, like Stephen Seiler, John Hawley, Professor Paul Larson, and you can go and listen to those as well. Also, of course, links to the paper, the Crosstalk that we mentioned, exercise training volume is more important than training intensity to promote increases in mitochondrial content. That was the basis for quite a large part of this discussion that we had. So you can go and check out that original paper from the show notes or from the episode description. One general update, and this is probably the last episode that I will, or the second to last episode I will promote this, but I'm looking to fill 2 roles at Scientific Triathlon, one project-based and one part-time recurring weekly task. The first one, the project, is we are looking to revamp the scientifictriathlon.com website very soon, and we need some professional help to do so. So if you are a web developer working with WordPress websites, then please contact me, Michael at scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K, to get more information. And the second role is the podcast show notes editor. So simply, we need somebody to take over the role of turning the audio content that I produce here on Mondays in the podcast episodes and turn that audio into well-written, well-structured text-based content on the website. So that is the show notes editor role. Again, email me if you're interested to get more information. Next Monday, I interview Dr. Charles Samuels, and the topic is sleep. It's a very interesting one, especially Dr. Samuels' take on wearables and how they probably do you more harm than good if you're tracking your sleep and trying to get objective data from that. So stay tuned for that, stay subscribed. Of course, in the meantime, there's a Q&A on Thursday to look forward to. As you are preparing for your races in 2020, if you are in need of any help or guidance, do check out scientifictriathlon.com and the training plans and coaching services that we offer there. That can help you get the most out of your 2020 training and racing season. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and take their free online sweat test to get an individualized hydration strategy for your next race. And get 15% off your order with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW15. Or get your first box or tube for free with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Go and check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear. And get 20% off your order with the promo code TTS20. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.